Before the gods decided on men, there was only the stone and the wind. Before the priests wrote the laws, there was only the biting truth of the snow. And this is the hardest truth of all. The struggle you embrace, the striving they praise in the market squares, is nothing but a frantic effort to outrun decay. But the road ends at the same pit for the king sweating on his throne and the slave crawling in the mud. The effort spent building a wall is only an elaborate method of telling the world exactly where the ruins will stand 1,000 years hence. They call it persistence. They call it purpose. It is only noise, hiding the silence of the inevitable. The cold cosmos does not measure your worth by how desperately you clawed your way up, but by how long you stood upright when the claws of the void finally came for your throat. The civilized man struggles to avoid dying. The wild man struggles only to live. And these are two different masters. The sun beat down on the bleached marble of Juthal. Once, 1,000 years ago, this city was the beating heart of some forgotten empire. Now, it was a skeleton picked clean by the desert winds. Dust devils danced through courtyards where kings once debated geometry and the nature of the soul. The very silence here was heavier than the clamor of any living city. I walked over polished floors, too fine for boots, floors that were meant for soft slippers and even softer morals. The great archways, carved with scenes of triumphs against unseen enemies, stood broken, monuments to their own eventual failure. The walls were covered in inscriptions, complex calculations for irrigation, poetry about eternal love, and intricate laws governing the width of a merchant's smile. They engineered everything: their water, their food, even their beliefs. They sought permanence, where only flux exists. They believed that by solving every possible future problem, they could escape the present moment. They confused comfort with security and dependency with order. Yet, they forgot the one engineering principle that matters: the strength of the soul under the simple weight of existence. All this complexity, all this striving for endless perfection, only served to make the inevitable fall steeper and the dust thicker. The structures that fought the hardest against the raw elements are now the grandest monuments to their comprehensive defeat. I kicked aside a piece of shattered pottery, an amphora finely painted with philosophers arguing under a lemon tree. It broke into smaller, finer dust. Ahead, in the main temple, where they stored the scrolls of their accumulated wisdom, I found the only thing that remained intact: a bronze statue of a man, seated, his chin resting on his hand. Not a god of war or a goddess of fertility, but a thinker. The inscription below the weathered bronze read, "He who mastered the self, mastered the world." This was the core of their great era. They built empires and libraries full of complex instructions on how to master themselves, yet they starved their souls by denying the basic animal truths of life. They strove to perfect an internal kingdom, while the real world, cold, bloody, and indifferent, battered their gates. This bronze man, with his smooth, tranquil face, symbolized the ultimate weakness of the civilized obsession, believing that peace is achieved through mental evasion rather than through physical acceptance of suffering. They saw Stoicism not as the iron resolve to act despite fear, but as a cozy chamber where they could debate whether fear even existed. They cultivated the mind, but allowed the hands to atrophy, the eyes to forget the color of real blood. They sought control over emotions they should have merely used as fuel for survival. The philosopher's ideal was rigid, demanding total compliance to an abstract virtue. The weak, needing structure clung to this rigidity, mistaking routine for strength. They dedicated their entire lives to achieving inner perfection, chasing a phantom ideal of character that had no utility when the sword descended. They were told to control their desires, to limit their ambition, to accept poverty gracefully, all while their leaders hoarded silk and gold. This philosophical resistance to external forces, death, hunger, invasion, became an excuse for inaction. They were taught that loss wasn't a tragedy, but merely an external event, deserving of intellectual resignation. But look at the desert outside these ruined walls. Loss is only external until the sand chokes your lungs. The barbarians, the wolves, do not debate the nature of fate. They meet fate with a snarl and a sharp tooth. The civilized man resisted the pain of existence by building ever higher mental fortifications. They created intricate moral systems to justify why they shouldn't have to fight for what they held dear. They said, "The goods of the world are transient," hoping that saying it would make the pillaging less painful. They rationalized their inability to defend their homes as supreme virtue. This is the great lie of the soft struggle. It avoids conflict by pretending the conflict doesn't matter. I drew my sword, testing the balance. The steel was cool, real, and undeniable. It did not care about the moral purity of my intentions, only the efficiency of my strike. This tool, raw iron and fire, was the opposite of their complex moralizing. Their methodology, their grand experiment in spiritual engineering, was to use endless thought to transcend physical reality. They aimed for an enlightened detachment. They spent years analyzing every potential misfortune, every possible outcome of life, until they were paralyzed by the sheer volume of their predictions. My methodology is simpler. The present moment is the only moment that exists. What is controllable? The swing of the arm, the angle of the shield, the next breath. I do not spend the night contemplating the eventual corrosion of the blade. I sharpen it now. The Stoic ideal, stripped of its academic fat, is simply the Barbaro's code. Act. Accept the limits of your power and unleash that power within those limits. The only true resistance to the world's grinding indifference is immediate, effective action. If an event is inevitable, debating its justice is a waste of vital heat. If it is preventable, then the debate is treason against survival. The civilized mind sought to understand the wheel of fortune. The warrior seeks only to avoid being crushed beneath it. In the center of the collapsed library, beneath a mound of dry, brittle papyrus, I found a half-preserved tablet. It detailed a complex, almost maniacal system of daily self-analysis. Lists of perceived faults, errors in judgment, and commitments to philosophical correction. It was a receipt of their never-ending internal debt. They measured success not by what they built or what they conquered, but by how few times they felt irritation during their morning commute. This tablet was the irrefutable proof of their sickness. They had externalized strength and internalized weakness. They worried more about the appearance of virtue than the utility of courage. They focused on the microscopic flaws of their own character, while the massive external forces of the wild world gathered to consume them. They believed that by controlling the flutter of their own eyelids, they controlled fate. The inevitable fall came not because the world was strong, but because their endless, meticulous inner struggle drained all the energy they needed for the real, outer struggle. Their philosophy became a prison, convincing them that the bars were merely an elaborate structure for meditation. They were domesticated animals arguing over the finest cut of grain, while the wolf sharpened its teeth on the wind. Consider the barbarian facing a harsh winter. He does not sit in a warm chamber writing poetry about the inevitability of the cold, nor does he debate the moral failings that led to the snow. He acts, he hunts, he gathers wood, he wraps himself in thick furs. His philosophy is muscle memory, not written text. This immediate, practical acceptance of reality. The cold is cold, the enemy is strong, the future is uncertain, is the true, primal Stoicism. The civilized men of Zuthal, however, developed complex analogies to explain away the harshness. They said, life was like a play. You must fulfill your role with dignity, regardless of whether you are the king or the pauper. This is the intellectual poison. It teaches the pauper to accept his chains because it is his role, rather than teaching him to break them because he is a man. They used reason like a dull knife, endlessly cutting away at the concept of suffering until only numb submission remained. The barbarian, when wounded, does not intellectualize the pain. He stitches the wound, drinks the raw spirits, and waits for the pain to pass, knowing it is a messenger, not a master. His struggle is simple, linear, and directed at the external threat. Their struggle was circular, internal, and directed only at their own capacity for feeling. This changes everything about how we view the strength of empires. We are taught that highly developed philosophical systems are the peak of civilization. We celebrate the men who can argue for days about ethics. But the evidence lies here, buried in sand. Their complex intellectual effort was directly proportional to their physical and spiritual decay. Their pursuit of moral perfection led them to an operational paralysis. They thought they were building character, but they were actually cultivating aversion to risk. When the invading armies finally arrived, likely crude, tough men who understood only the mathematics of iron and bone, the people of Zuthal did not fight with the fury of desperation. They retreated into their moral superiority, arguing that the invaders were merely externals and their imminent death was preferred by nature. They died clean deaths, perhaps, but they died weak deaths. They surrendered their physical existence in exchange for a theoretical, moral victory. This is not Stoicism. It is self-deception wrapped in silk robes. True strength is not the ability to smile politely while being ruined. It is the ability to look ruin in the face and break its jaw before it touches you. The consequence of their intellectual struggle was the complete failure of biological survival. As I climbed to the highest tower, now broken like a rotten tooth, the wind carried a new question. If the endless striving for inner purity and the rejection of externals is a path to ruin, what is the next challenge for the man who understands the truth of the wild? It is not merely the avoidance of weakness, but the management of power. The barbarian knows that strength attracts enemies as surely as honey attracts flies. He must not fall into the trap of becoming so powerful that he too begins to believe his structures are permanent. The new challenge is self-discipline without self-denial. The wild man must strive, not for philosophical purity, but for competence. He fights, not to prove his moral superiority, but simply to survive the next night. The danger for the strong is hubris, the belief that because they conquered one danger, they are immune to the next. The ruins of Zuthal warn us not only against being weak, but against being secure in our strength. The moment a man stops fighting the external world and starts arguing with his own shadow, he has already begun to rot. That is the next great conflict, maintaining the savage discipline of the external struggle, even when the internal self begs for the soft cushion of civilized ease. This whole silent valley of broken marble teaches a simple, brutal lesson about the image of man. The civilized man wants the world to be controllable. He seeks to impose human logic, laws, treaties, moral codes upon a fundamentally indifferent, chaotic universe. He sees the struggle as the process of converting the wild into the tame, the unpredictable into the measured. He wants assurance. He wants legacy. But nature, the eternal barbarian, operates under no such delusion. The image of man that survives is the one who understands his small place in the cold cosmos. He is temporary, his creations are temporary, but his immediate, decisive action is real. The great picture is not of empires that stand forever, but of cycles, the rise of the organized weakness, followed by the cleansing fury of raw strength, followed by the inevitable silence. The ultimate struggle is not between virtue and vice, or control and passion. It is between the lie of permanence that civilization sells and the cold, enduring fact of flux that the mountains teach. The universe is a constant tide of building and breaking. Those who flow with the tide, acting swiftly on the moment they inhabit, survive longest. Those who try to stop the tide with complex philosophical barriers are merely swept away cleaner. I stood on the tower, watching the twin moons rise over the bleached ruins of Xuthal. The legacy of their relentless internal struggle is dust and silence. What remains is only the wind, whistling through the empty chambers where philosophers once debated the definition of contentment. The stones, carved with the history of their unshakable laws, are now merely grit under my boot. Their ambition to achieve spiritual immutability only ensured their physical annihilation. Their legacy is a warning etched in sand that the most dangerous lie is the idea that struggle must be intellectual, internal, and clean. They believed their wisdom would preserve them. They left behind elaborate arguments proving why their coming ruin shouldn't bother them. But wisdom, without the steel to enforce it, is merely a sophisticated suicide note. All that survives is the hard fact of the natural world. Strength answers to strength, and weakness answers to the grave. The coldness of the stones remains, indifferent to the heated arguments that once filled the halls. The truth of the wild is simple, and it always outlasts the complexity of the tamed. I turned my back on the silent city. The scent of dry stone and old regret clung to the air, but the scent of the open desert was stronger, cleaner, laced with the metallic tang of freedom. The true meaning of the struggle is not to achieve an end state of philosophical calm, but to maintain the edge, the readiness, the fierce commitment to the present action. The civilized man seeks peace. The barbarian seeks competence. And competence, in a harsh world, is the closest thing to peace you will ever grasp. Do not be fooled by the high priests of complexity who preach the struggle against the self. That is where weakness takes root. Do not mistake elaborate moral code for true character. Character is what is revealed when the fight begins, not what is debated beforehand. The ultimate lesson of Xuthal is this: the world does not owe you tranquility, nor does it reward your good intentions. It rewards swift action and unflinching resolve. The only true control you possess is over the moment directly ahead of you. Grasp it, hold it, sharpen it. And when the walls fall, ensure you are outside, sword in hand, ready to meet the inevitable cold with the necessary heat.